I mean, probably the first thing is its history. Briefly, it was founded almost 150 years ago now. And so it's something that came about at a very particular period in human history. I think the initial founding idea was that there was certain need for a different avenue for human thinking. The way it was expressed in the early days of the Theosophical Society was that there were two forces that were active at the time of its founding. One of them was taking it, both of them were forces that were described as degrading in their influence. But one of them was described as degrading superstition, which was primarily related to the kind of religious approaches in the world at that time, which has not really changed much in our time either. But the basic idea that there is somebody, some representative of any one of the religions that stands between you and the experience of truth or God or spirit. And that then there are certain formalities and dictates that are told to you that you are encouraged not to think about, but to obey. And so this was degrading superstition, was the way that it was called. Obviously, every religion also has its uplifting aspect, but a lot of the practice of religion has been confinement of thought rather than expansion. So that was one current that was influencing humanity and the thinkers related to human beings. The other one was described as still more degrading, brutal materialism. So, in the late 1800s, the idea that was prevalent was that this is the universe is a mechanism. It's mechanical, it's material, we're governed by material laws. And, more and more science was replacing religion as the system of belief that people turned to because it could prove what it talked about. Most religions had a lot of difficulty proving things. But so the idea was that the proofs that were offered were all based on a material, purely physical environment. And so this materialistic sort of thinking was one that was crowding out the possibility for consciousness or spirit or God, whatever term there was for some overarching universal intelligence that we all participate within. So these were the two trends that were very active. So the idea was that this Theosophical Society could present an alternative approach, something that kind of expressed the idea that the religious approaches of the world, however many they are and however diverse they seem, are at their essence are unified. There's a unity in that. And that it is even possible for science to move beyond, the blinding influence of a soul focus on the material world. That consciousness, even to do an experiment, there's consciousness involved. So it's obvious. But the problem for them was, consciousness, you can't measure it. And in the absence of some sort of system that conforms to the scientific approach, you can measure its effects, but consciousness itself was unmeasurable. So the idea was to present these ageless ideas, and HPB really was presenting the ageless based on how they had appeared over human history. So they appeared in ancient times all the way up until now. So a variety of ideas that really had been barely considered. We had strayed away from interacting with this other level. And so the idea, I think, being that it was something that could have a restorative influence on humanity. Just to point your minds in these directions, that the ideas are so powerful that it's something that can have an effect on human society. So that was the meaning of the Theosophical Society's founding. So to be a member associated with that, well, I mean, what does that mean? Well, clearly, if you feel that there is some value to these ideas about the powers that are latent within everyone, the powers that everybody links into, whether it's, a lot of people tend to think in terms of telepathy or psychic perception. Those are expressions of consciousness. But the idea that at its very highest level, there is this unity that is spoken of. And so the possibility for anyone is to move toward this level of a consciousness that is unseparated from all others. And so part of that expression means that if something like this unity is true, then there is a need. And the need is to link ourselves with one another, to remember that we are constantly linked with one another. So these ideas of compassion, of love, these are active principles that you would expect to somehow be a part of the thinking and the behavior of someone who is a member of the Theosophical Society, someone who feels as if there's value here. Certainly, I could talk about that superficially. I mean, one of the questions that everybody always asks is, who was HPB, the real HPB? Both of them obviously were exceptional people. HPB for her, it was expressed that the Mahatmas, the masters, spent 100 years. There was this movement in humanity that was required, but who could they find that they could work through? Because, part of the idea of the masters is that, they don't impose, but they do influence. And so who is it that is most highly someone that can be connected to? And HPB during her particular lifetime, came upon, I guess, the screen of their awareness, and as someone who really had these phenomenal, really psychic abilities, but also very clearly someone who had some multi-life experience with the masters. And so they found someone who could be used for these purposes. And so she became that person. Many things happened in her life. As a child, they describe her, psychic abilities, telling about things that were going to happen and making things happen. As she grew older, there were all sorts of phenomenal events that were always taking place around her. Tables levitating and, things knocking on the door. You sit there and have something knock on the inside of your glasses or something. Phenomena. And, they would occur around her as she grew and matured in her abilities and understanding. Those things became things that she could reproduce at will. So all of this was the maturation process. In her 20s, she came in contact with the person she had been seeing in her visions for all of her life, that she regarded as a presence who had been overseeing and helping and aiding her. And it was this one known as the Master Moria. And from that point onward, her work took a very different sort of direction. She came to the United States because at that time, it's almost hard for us to imagine now, but the phenomenon that was known as spiritualism was something that had really erupted on the scene, particularly in the United States. There was a particular region in the state of New York, mainly into Vermont and other areas, that was described as the burned over district. because in this, youthful United States at that point, this was a district where they say the spirit had burned over had been over this area and ignited it with fire. So there were a lot of religions that were very active, but spiritualism, this idea that there were people who had died, but that the consciousness of those people persists and can in fact connect and, speak to, through the proper medium, speak to their loved ones and things like that. So it was a phenomenon that was occurring very strongly. It was something that was in the daily newspapers in cities like New York and, big cities. So it wasn't just a crazy fad. Part of the problem with the spiritualism thing was that there were aspects of it that were undeniable. Things happen. And how do you explain them? Of course, with any phenomenon like that, it also attracted people who could see that it was a possible source for a living. And, there were people who manipulated things to make it look like they were phenomenal, staged things. But anyway, she came to the United States, and it was in the United States that she connected with Henry Olcott, who was an American. H.P. Blavatsky was born in Russia, I guess, actually present-day Ukraine, but Russia at that time. And Olcott was an American and a lawyer by training, and a very high-level lawyer. But he had taken an interest, actually from his very early days, he had an interest in, extrasensory phenomena. But when this spiritualism thing started to rise, he was a person who was an investigator. I mean, he was called upon when President Lincoln was assassinated. They called Henry Olcott to come and try and work out and track the people who were the assassins. Equally, during the American Civil War, he was called in as an investigator because there was so much corruption and graft going on. They needed someone to put an end to that, to investigate it, find out who was doing. So he was very successful in those things. Spiritualism was something that he felt there was really something valid there, but he wanted to be able to weed out the imposters. So he set up all these very exacting sorts of experiments. I mean, he put scales underneath the mediums to weigh them during the course of these phenomena to see if the weight changed. He had all kinds of elaborate things to weed out imposter. Anyway, there was one very famous case that was going on with two brothers, and I think it was in Vermont. He went there. The same time that he came there, H.P. Blavatsky came there. And they met, and there was this immediate connection. They were both living in New York at that time. He followed up with her, and this very, very strong connection formed. Out of that, it piqued Olcott's interest in all things related to phenomena. I mean, that was really the focus of his initial interest, to try to explain some of these phenomena. But it was really based in phenomena. HPB's thing was that this whole spiritualism, while real, was hugely misinterpreted, and the explanations that were presented were actually so far out that they distorted an actual truth. So anyway, they came together, and then it was as his interest deepened and the longer he stayed around HPB, he became aware that what she was talking about was really something much more than phenomena, and that it was an ageless system of thought that can be expressed, and that the idea of this hierarchy, where there's humans and there are beings beyond human, became something that he started to recognize was very real. Ultimately, he made his own connection with these masters of the wisdom, and then he committed to this Theosophical movement. They started the Theosophical Society. Initially, it was a group of people who were interested in these subjects, and they came together, and then it became something that required more, and finally they formed this thing they were going to call the Theosophical Society. It was an idea that was a name that was suggested by someone that was a member of this group. So out of that, the society formed, and they had, some interesting talks and things. But then clearly it wasn't enough. And, Olcott committed completely to this. His finances, his life, everything, his time. Ultimately, they moved to India within a very, very few years. And when they came here is when the Theosophical Society really took off. It exploded because the connection with this long history of Indian spirituality, plus also the suppression of that spirituality that was the experience from the British colonial rule, they became exponents of the value of it. And then the Theosophical Society grew. So they committed a lifetime to that. In many ways, HPB was, in a sense, the heart of this theosophical movement. Olcott was the body, so the development of the society, how it would function, how it would operate in other countries, that was all his work. But the actual wisdom aspect of it was something that really was mainly transmitted through Blavatsky. One of the core ideas in many ways within this ageless wisdom teaching is the idea of spiritual evolution, you could call it. And out of that idea, there is the necessary idea that there are, levels of unfoldment that occur within humanity. That there is such a thing as a highly developed humanity. The things that are spoken of in most religions, where you have the idea of, saints and messiahs and avatars, enlightened beings, that sort of idea. So consistent with that is this idea of the masters of the wisdom, the term that many have used is Mahatmas. Blavatsky's preference was the masters. But the idea being that these are people who, much like us, have passed through the range of human experience, have in each case been able to cultivate consciousness to the point that it's something that is able to release itself from the many ways that people are trapped in, the conditionings of 1,000 false identities as a nation, nationalism, personal want, sorts. But they've been able to rise above that to the level of understanding that makes them, in many ways, they're described as perfected human beings. And that one of the avenues, certainly, that is opens itself to someone of that level of development is the avenue to try to assist humanity in this same process of self-transformation. And so many of them, whatever their work is, probably the majority of what they do is described as being done on the mental plane. So they're not out building houses and things like that, but they're in this process of continually radiating a certain very high level of thought that from time to time there are people, in our human community that access that. So you find it very often in, poetry and art, in some of the very far-reaching sorts of philosophers, and we find it also in moments of our own unfoldment. And so that's something where this level of thought, being able to access this and then bring down some measure of that into our normal functioning, has the capacity to uplift. So it's a long range sort of process. That's what evolution is. So these are these masters and something related to their work. In the early days of the Theosophical Society, there was this level of communication that took place where letters between, mainly it was between the letters as they are preserved now were primarily between two British gentlemen and these Mahatmas. These are people who had become very much interested in this theosophy thing that seemed to be taking shape here in India and wanted to know more. They came to know H.P. Blavatsky, and she would talk to them about this idea of the masters and how they are trying, through this movement to help influence humanity. They wanted to make a direct contact. And for whatever reason, it was something that it took place in the form of these kind of question and answer letter exchange. So these became the Mahatma letters that were published after the recipients had died. Initially, they were not intended for publication. In fact, it was advised by the authors of those letters, the masters, that these, because it's such a partial aspect of what we're trying to communicate, it might be more confusing than enlightening. But then, since it was in fact published, it has become something that is probably, it's more enlightening than confusing for people who have followed them and try to think their way into what it is that's trying to be communicated. So those are the principal Mahatma letters. There were letters that were written to others, of course, but those are the main ones that we're familiar with. My favorite way of saying what is the human being is drawn from some of the things H.P. Blavatsky said, but it's kind of rooted in this ageless wisdom tradition. The idea as expressed is that the human being is highest spirit and lowest matter, linked by mind. So highest spirit is linked with the most basest matter, and the continuum across which it moves is what we would describe as mind. So then for me, I like that because then it also makes clear where it is we are charged to operate in this human being, in this human life. So the mind and its understanding of it and its cultivation, because that description says that mind moves all the way. Mind is perhaps not spirit, is perhaps not matter, but it touches on both. And so the cultivation of this mind, also the idea that the human being is not either one or the other. It's not that you are a purely spiritual being. Certainly it's not that you're a material being. So how do you embrace that in this life? One of the other things the ageless wisdom adds to this is the idea that, we tend to think of ourselves as one thing. If I say, who am I? We tend to point to ourselves, I'm Tim. But it speaks about really the human being more so as a cooperative project, that there are countless levels of intelligence operative within the human being. On the most basic level, we're aware of this because a human being, you have individual cells, trillions of those. Each one has separate functions. Each one has a certain consciousness that it expresses. You put a certain number of those together, and then you have organs within the body that express a certain type of intelligence. So all of that we know. And even beyond that, bacteria. the cells of bacteria within the human body outnumber the human cells. So there are these communities of intelligence operative in the physical body. So, for someone who has the capacity or the willingness to try and extend that, there is the idea that their intelligence is not confined to matter. And so if this is operative at this level, the ancient Hermetic proverb, as it is below, so it is above, as it is within, so it is without. If it's operative below, there is some similar process operative at higher levels. In the theosophical kind of approach, there's this idea of really great, highly expansive intelligence that might be described as Dayan Chohan's. This level of intelligence that very often when we think or speak of it, we think of it as laws of nature, or because it's so overwhelming the way it imprints itself. So the very highest of these participate in this human experiment. So, to someone who starts to find that there's a reality to this way of seeing, then it becomes, you have to ask yourself, how can I link myself and participate with this more fully? And then you have to get into the element of practice. And that's a completely different, that's a subject unto itself. But the idea that there are truths necessitate the idea that until we can come into the fullness of their expression and understanding, then we need to have some approach to connecting ourselves more deeply with that, to be more fully human. Really, we're partially human at this point, because one other way that the human being is described, and the mind, is that within each one is the mind to embrace the universe. This is one of these components within the human being. Again, this Dhyani Chohan idea that within us there is this mind to embrace the universe. And, anybody who's honest with themselves will say, well, maybe I'm not there yet. Maybe I have a little way to go. So, then really, to me, the all-important question becomes, how do you do that? What have people who have actually affected this, have done this, what do they say? Can I test that for myself? Which is all important. Because otherwise, if somebody's just telling you and you're responding to, the fact that they sit on a podium and it must be true, it's another religion. So, that becomes very, very important. Once you recognize what it means to be human, then how can you perfect that? How can you magnify that capability?